Do you remember the 80s? Glorious times, the age of extreme fashion, heavy metal, break dancing and mixtape. A strange and magical era which is still widely celebrated. But not in Latin America. They consider the 80s the lost decade. Why? Because they faced financial turmoil in the 80s, a debt typhoon which eroded their economies. What was the trigger? Two large oil price shocks. Skyrocketing oil prices disrupted their finances, created big deficits and surpluses, took their foreign debt to unprecedented highs and pushed their economies to the point of collapse. Mexico was the first country to fall. In 1982, it declared that it will not be able to pay its debt. What followed was a series of sovereign defaults in Latin America. One country after another was engulfed in the debt crisis. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, all of them fell like dominoes. They faced deep recession, high inflation, mounting debt, unemployment, and slow economic growth. 3 decades on, is history about to repeat itself? Look around you. Developing countries the world over are struggling with a sovereign debt crisis. One of them has already succumbed, Sri Lanka. Its economy has collapsed, ballooning debt and shrinking foreign reserves. There isn't enough money to pay for basic necessities. Of course, this crisis is of Sri Lanka's own making. The Rajapaksas mismanaged the finances. They spent more than the national income. They allowed deep tax cuts and destroyed the economy. But the world did not help. Look at the global factors at play: the pandemic-induced slowdown, the growing cost of borrowing, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has increased food and fuel prices. These factors compounded the Lankan crisis. And they still persist. The fear is that the Lankan crisis could mutate. Experts say Colombo is just the canary in the coal mine. More countries are set to fall. The entire developing world is at risk. Hello and welcome to Gravitas Plus. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. On the 15th of February, exactly 9 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, the World Bank issued a warning. Developing nations face a looming debt crisis. The World Bank named 70 countries, 70 low and middle income countries facing debt repayments worth $11 billion. The report said this burden could crush their economies in 2022. 9 days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. The invasion disrupted supply chains, it threw financial markets into disarray and triggered a global oil crisis. The economic forecasts became darker and starker. In March, the United Nations released this report. It said there were 107 economies that face at least one of the 3 risks. Number 1, rising food prices. Number 2, rising energy prices. And 3, tougher financial conditions. 107 countries face these risks. Together, they represent 1.7 billion people. That's more than 1/5 of humanity. There are 69 countries that face all the 3 risks: food, energy, finance, all 3. 69 countries could go the Sri Lanka way. 25 in Africa, 25 in the Asia Pacific, and 19 in Latin America. Which countries are these? We'll start with Egypt, the land of pharaohs. It is in the throes of a financial crisis. Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat. Russia and Ukraine were its top suppliers. As they fight now, the supplies are running out. Last month, Egypt said that its wheat reserves will not last more than 3 months. Next, we have Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring. Its economy is overheating. Foreign debt accounts for 100% of its GDP. The trade deficit has widened to $800 million. Inflation stands at 7%. Fuel prices at record highs. Experts say Tunisia could soon face civil unrest. The same warning has been issued for Lebanon, the Switzerland of West Asia. Well, not anymore. In 2020, the Beirut blasts destroyed Lebanon's largest grain stores. Food prices went up by 11 times. The Lebanese pound lost 90% of its value. Public debt grew to 360% of the GDP. The war in Ukraine complicated things further. Lebanon imported 80% of its wheat from Ukraine. Those supplies have fallen. There's a bread shortage, a scarcity of sunflower oil. Lebanon has been forced to take a $150 million loan from the World Bank to ensure food security. Then we have Argentina, the land of tango, also caught on the wrong foot now. Inflation is paralyzing its economy. External debt is mounting. Argentina has defaulted on debt repayments 9 times. To avoid a 10th default, it has gone to the IMF. It wants to refinance a $45 billion loan. It may give Argentina a brief reprieve, but it will not quell the civil unrest. Analysts say Argentina is staring at a long and cold winter this year. Some other Latin American countries are also at risk, like El Salvador and Peru. They face hyperinflation in commodities, tumbling bonds, food shortages, detonating prices, and mass unemployment. Very much like Sri Lanka. Reports say both countries could soon face civil unrest. In sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia could be the worst hit. In Ghana, debt levels are soaring, interest payments are choking the economy, a debt crisis looks imminent. In Kenya, the debt has climbed to $70 billion, that's 70% of its GDP. Last week, they got a $244 million loan from the IMF to weather this economic storm. In South Africa, the debt has reached 80% of its GDP. There's a looming threat of state collapse, a rerun of the 2021 civil unrest. Next comes Turkey. The currency is sliding, the debt is soaring, upwards of 54% of the GDP. Inflation has touched 70%. GDP forecast cut to 3.3%. There's a food shortage. Turkey is getting 50,000 tons of wheat from India. And these were just a few examples. The World Bank says that in the next 12 months, as many as a dozen developing economies may not be able to service their debt. This will be the largest debt crisis in a generation. What about India? It will feel the impact. A few state economies are already inching towards a debt crisis. In Punjab, West Bengal, Bihar and Andhra Pradesh, the debt to GDP ratio is identical to Sri Lanka's. On the 3rd of April, Indian bureaucrats expressed concern. They said populist measures in these states could ruin their economies and leave them broke like Sri Lanka. Now, here's the thing. The entire world is in debt distress. National budgets are at breaking point. Some governments are being forced to cut spending. Others are borrowing more to stay afloat. What can we do to stop this? How can the world prevent a debt typhoon? We spoke to experts and we've compiled a roadmap. This is what they say needs to be done urgently and collectively. Number one, manage borrowing and lending better. Creditors should offer contingency plans to borrowers, plans to pause repayments if the borrower faces financial difficulties. Number two, introduce better ways to manage shocks and crises. Low-income countries are always vulnerable to external crises. A high proportion of their debt is in foreign currency. This makes their economies vulnerable to external changes. We need to develop a mechanism which insulates them from such shocks, a mechanism to restructure unsustainable debts better. Solution number three, expand the common framework's eligibility criteria. What's that? It's a framework established by the G20. It's supposed to help poor countries restructure their debt. Well, so far, this framework applies to only 73 of the poorest countries in the world. It should be expanded. It should cover other highly indebted countries, also vulnerable lower middle income countries. Solution number four, promote alternatives to borrowing. Lower income countries face major public financing shortfalls, even for basic public needs like healthcare and education. Studies say if these countries improve tax collection, they can reduce the need for borrowing more. Fifth solution, increase accountability and transparency, both for borrowers and lenders. For instance, the World Bank has often raised concerns over the terms of lending by Chinese creditors. A 2021 study found that Chinese contracts include unusual confidentiality clauses. No secret there. They allow the lenders to influence the borrower's domestic and foreign policies. Sri Lanka is a classic example. It let China dictate its domestic policy in return for money, and this needs to end. We need a framework which protects countries from falling into debt traps laid by the likes of China. For far too long, the world has looked the other way. Debt crisis in developing economies is now a security issue. Relief comes too little and too late. And this must change. We need preemptive action, an approach that prevents such crises. This is the biggest lesson from the pandemic. Any crisis can have a domino effect. A small event in a far-off land can trigger an unstoppable chain reaction. So Sri Lanka may just be the beginning. There's no saying where it ends.